Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lecture series, the third lecture in our webcast of the lecture series. This particular lecture has been jointly organized by the Cohab Indian Diaspora Center, the HR College University of Mumbai, and the Dr. B.M.N. College, SNDT University, which is an autonomous college. So we have, as we did with the earlier webcast, we have a joint program, a three-day joint program. We are very happy to have Dr. Mala Pandurang, Professor Mala Pandurang, giving a talk today, which is not in our law, literature and diaspora series, but it is in our general diaspora lecture series. Although anyone who joins us from the law department would be really welcome. The title of Mala's talk today is Exploring the Aesthetics of an Asian African Heritage through the work of Sultan Somjee. Before I invite Mala to speak, a very brief introduction. She has sent me a very modest bio note, but then Mala, I've known Mala for decades now, and she was a very modest person, and continues to be a very modest person. She is the professor and principal at the Dr. B.M.N. College of Home Science, I think it is, affiliated to the SNDT Women's University, and it is an autonomous college now. And she has been or is the postdoctoral fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Germany, and has been now nominated as the ambassador scientist to India for the years 2019 to 2022. Her research grants, she has got several, but I'm sure she has given us only very few out of that, include a Fulbright visiting professorship at the University of Texas, Austin. She has been the recipient of the Charles Wallace Research Grant, UK. She has got major and minor research projects from the UGC. She has been a visiting associate at the Advanced Studies, Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and she had an NET and a JRF from UGC, and under her tenure, the B.M.N. College is doing very well. We know that, and it has been selected for the UGC Stride Center, congratulations Mala, for research capacity building 2020 to 2023. So some more feathers in Mala's already quite full cap. Her research areas include post-colonial writing, diaspora theory, and gender studies. And in the year 2012, she received the SNDT Women University's Maharshi Karve Utkrashta Shikshak Puraskar, Best Teacher Award from the Governor of Maharashtra. Mala, very happy to have you here. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nilufer, for that very generous introduction. I will just take a moment to share my screen before I start. Okay. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, all right, okay. Once again, thank you, Dr. Barucha, for the privilege to be here this afternoon to speak on a topic that is very close to my heart. I understand that our audience this afternoon is a mixture of undergraduate students as well as seasoned scholars of the diaspora. And I'm going to try my best to balance my talk between offering general background to the topic and more theoretical aspects, so that I can reach out to both these categories of listeners. My presentation this afternoon is derived from a project that I had conducted with a major research grant from the UGC titled Wives, Mothers and Others, a social literary investigation into the lives of early women migrants to East Africa. And this project that I took up focused on reconstructing gendered accounts of migration from India to East Africa at the interstices of colonial and post-colonial histories of the former British colonies. We are all quite aware that Indian laborers were transported in thousands across the oceans from the mid-19th century to the former European colonies to work in plantations under the indentured system, also known as the Kalapani phenomenon. They left their homelands never to return. On the other hand, those who traveled to East Africa, other than the labor that was taken to construct the railway there, are referred to as free passengers because they paid for their own passage on the ships. And these passenger Indians were mainly traders who had more economic stability and greater freedom of mobility than the indentured laborers. Most of these traders, just a minute. Yeah. Most of these traders were from the western regions of Gujarat and Saurashtra, and the traders made trips back and forth between the Indian subcontinent and Africa, and therefore sustaining ties with the mother culture. I just gave a reference to the railway line, which you can see on the map, goes from Mombasa to Nairobi. And the traders gradually followed the railway line as it was being constructed and were used by the British to open up the interior parts of East Africa to establish trading posts there so that the colonial administrators could follow them and set up their own colonial posts. Marriages between these traders and women back in the homeland were arranged. And therefore, over time, what happened is that the migrants established family migration networks, similar to what you had happening in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. But the history of these early women migrants have remained subsumed within the larger collective history of their husbands and fathers. And there are very few documented records to capture the finer nuances of gendered individual and collective mobility of the wives and mothers and others. And this is the title that I gave to my project. It was in the course of my socio-literary excavations to reconstruct these unheard subaltern experiences that I first came across the work of Kenyan-born ethnographer Sultan Somjee and his commendable attempt to curate an exhibition on the Asian African heritage in Nairobi in 2020 at the National Museums of Kenya. And subsequent to this effort, outstanding effort, Somjee published a very engaging handbook, Stories from Things, Write Your Memoirs in 10 Steps, which is intended to help the reader to use one's collection of daily things to unlock memory through 10 simple steps. For example, we have a picture of an old watch on the cover and how you could reconstruct your family history using material objects that are there in your own households. And the stories of one's life thus articulated can be collated into a collective legacy to be passed on to the next generation. And this is one of the things that he tried out in this particular museum that he curated. My focus this afternoon is on two very absorbing ethnographic, historical, creative narratives by Somjee, titled Beat By, published in 2012, and Home Between Crossings, published in 2016. Somjee hails from the Ismaili Koja community, and his narratives offer a rare gendered perspective into the multi-generational and transnational life histories of Ismaili Koja women in colonial and post-colonial Kenya. Through his narratives, he weaves together very minute details. Being an ethnographer, he weaves together minute details of the daily domestic lives of the first and second generation Koja community with poignant poetic lyricism. So he brings his creative talent together with his ethnographic training. But at the same time, his narratives remind us that the composition of the community of Asian women in East Africa was by no means homogeneous, but demarcated by a number of internal and external religious, caste, and class boundaries. The time span of these two narratives that I will focus on extends from the early years of settlement from the turn of the 19th century leading up to the 1930s and 40s, which Gisbek Ung describes as the golden age for the Asian community in East Africa. And then with the 1950s comes the Mau Mau rebellion, the rise of African nationalism, independence, and growing anti-Asian sentiment. And the second narrative, Home Between Crossing, ends with the traumatic dislocation of his central protagonist, Sakina, also known as Motibai, from her birth country, Kenya, and her subsequent relocation to Canada. And by the 1960s and 70s, you had a very large number of East African Asians moving out of East Africa because of the outright nationalization of property, the expulsion from Uganda in 1972, and therefore they came to constitute what is known as a double diaspora. Somjee recreates the community of the Satpan Kojas who have played an indispensable role in the expansion of British imperialist and commercial interests in East Africa. We have, for example, as I put up on the screen, tales of legendary merchants such as Ali Dina Visram, who arrived in East Africa in 1863 at the age of 12, and Sewa Haji Paru, who came to be known as the Merchant King of the Coast. By the early 20th century, Koja women had begun to arrive mainly as child brides. They engaged in maintaining family and religious community values and networks, which formed the basis of the economic, social, and cultural capital of their households within the norms of an inherently patriarchal and non-assimilative community. There have been recent reconstructions of the lives of the male entrepreneurs of the community, and the tendency has been to focus on a sense of adventure, business acumen, and success in economic and public spheres, focusing on the contribution of these early businessmen to the economy of East Africa. And Sultan Somjee's work is one of the rare attempts to reinsert the marginalized life of women into the history of commerce of the community. Importantly, for those of us who teach diaspora narratives, we know that most diasporic narratives tend to focus on issues of connecting issues of identity to the trauma of dislocation. What Somjee does, and that's unique, is he presents a hitherto unexplored imaginative space drawing from the interface of art and ideas from his own childhood experience at his uncle's bead shop in Masailand, his Koja and his Swahili heritage, as well as his extensive field work as an ethnographer working among the ethnic people of Kenya. And in doing so, he weaves a network of affinities across ethnic and racial boundaries, and he redefines the notion of Africanity as being associated mainly with a Black racial identity. Okay? The whole idea that if you are brown, then maybe you are not African enough. Okay? Now, the material artifact of beads is central to the narrative, as the title of the first novel goes, Beadwise. Somjee traces back as to how the Indian merchants traded in beads with the indigenous tribes of East Africa, for whom the beads provided significant aesthetic material for expression. These very astute merchants soon came to recognize the preference of the tribes for different colors of beads in terms of their colors, luster, size, and shapes. By 1905, Koja merchant Rajan Lalji had established a wholesale business in beads and started to supply stocks to interiors via Mombasa Railway, the Mombasa-Nairobi Railroad settlement of Dukawalas. Somjee's great-grandfather, who arrived in Mombasa from India in 1902, and he sold beads to the neighboring ethnic people sitting on a mat at the marketplace. In a personal interview, Somjee explained to me that before the trade in beads was popularized, the Maasai wore ornaments made of metal and natural objects like shells and seeds. However, the range of colors was limited and scarce, and therefore the beads opened a huge dimension of visual culture. He also shared that the bead stocks were imported from Czechoslovakia, Europe, and therefore you already had this kind of global trade that was going on, and they represented a new mode of aesthetic material for the nomadic Maasai in remote regions. In due time, an entire street on the commercial side of Nairobi came to be known as Moti or Bead Bazaar, where women handled the bead display, prepared and organized the bead stock. I am grateful to Sultan Somjee for allowing me to use photographs from his personal collection, as well as for time spent in repeated personal interviews. In another interview, he explains how he was inspired by the lives of young girls who arrived in Africa from the ages of 9 to 13 as wives, as child brides of merchants, and to quote him, they became mothers and they died as grandmothers. They grew up in the geography of Africa, and he would encounter these women who traded in beads as grandmothers while he went on his own ethnographic research trips into remote areas in the interior. Also during his childhood, he spent time at his uncle's bead shop in Maasai land, working with beads under the watchful eyes of his mother, who worked with beads herself. It was not unusual for women in Asian trading families to work at the family stores, handling beads and negotiating with clients. And this again is the aspect of the other in the title that I kind of mentioned at the beginning of my paper, my wives, mothers, and others. Because most of our gendered reconstruction looks at the position of these women as either wives and mothers. But there is also the other, for example, these women who were very enterprising entrepreneurs. These women often became fluent in local vernaculars and understood the aesthetic differences among the local cultures. And bead buy, therefore, reinserts into East African history the forgotten and fascinating life of this group of women who came to be known as the bead buys. What I intend to do in this paper is to show how Somjee's presentation of this interaction goes beyond a mere entrepreneurial venture, and rather how he explores how the beads opened up an entirely new dimension of a visual culture, and in doing so, he enabled a unique interface between Asian women and the indigenous communities, which is not often discussed in reconstructions of the history of the Asian community in East Africa. Somjee's protagonist in his first novel, Bead Buy, is a young girl called Sakina. She is born in 1922 in Nairobi. Her family lives in the Indian shanty town, which is part of a racially compartmentalized Nairobi under British rule. Sakina learns from her grandmother how to display bead samples in different sets and sizes, sets of blue and whites and reds for the Maasai. But she's also taught the traditional Koja Zari embroidery on black velvet caps meant for Koja girls, which they sell towards saving an amount for their own dowries. We come to learn that embroidery was not an unusual activity among poorer sections of the Asian community. And I quote Dana Seidenberg, who says that they sold the embroidery, beadwork, and sewing, as well as prepared sweet samosas and bhajias to other Asians and Africans. Somjee engages with the trope of embroidery as an aesthetic art, as a means of offering an insight into the lives of the women of the community, derived from, and I quote, their private memories of embroidered dresses, pacharis, saris, and shawls like the bandhani. While Sakina is not sent to school for a formal education, she learns to write in Gujarati from her grandfather, Dada Papa, whose handwriting is described as dancing like a string of singing pearls on paper. She likens the aesthetic experience of the art of calligraphy to the graceful movement of the hand and the needle while doing embroidery. An experience thus a deep aesthetic experience comparable to, and I quote, a voice inside that calls to you in the moment of timelessness when you have no thought or memory, unquote. Sakina experiences a similar rush when she keenly observes Bakari, the Swahili watchman in the Indian bazaar, as he embroiders a supple kofia cap with silk thread while humming a Swahili Ibadi prayer, which in itself is a synthesis of multiple influences. The art of my forefathers carried from the old country on the Arabian Sea that opens its arms to the Indian Ocean, washing the African continent. Unquote. Somjee thus creates a pluralistic space across gender and cultural divides through the multiple movements of interaction between the eyes, hands, and songs while working with art. And as a passage from the text states, the movements of the watchman's fingertips marking the rhythm in the Qasida music captivate me. His voice rises up and down and pauses in between. His fingers go up and down, filling in a line and leaving out a space between the lines. I stand and listen to the hymn's melody and watch the needle point. I hear the beauty and then the elation. How his voice and fingertips work one into the other, the song into the heart. Sakina is married at 16 to Hyder Ali Devji, and she leaves for a new home at Nairobi. So she moves from Nairobi and she moves towards the inland into Maasai country. As she journeys out for the first time from the urban locale of Nairobi, the beauty of the savannah, the beauty of the African savannah grips her imagination, and she experiences a spiritual bonding between the vast Maasai cosmogeography and her own limited environment. This freedom associated with the vast open spaces of the African savannah and the African grassland is stifled by the domestic expectations of Sakina's mother-in-law. Sakina is expected to have a son, cover her head with a pachadi, and screen her face with her pachadi enlarged. Sakina seeks respite from this very suffocating domestic routine by spending her afternoons at the family store, which deals with beads, and she observes how the shop assistant, who is a Maasai elder called Ole Lekakini, works with beads with his fingers. And she compares his art to the Koja Zari embroidery that she has learned. And she yearns to master this new bead craft, which she acknowledges as visual knowledge. She also imbibes the tactile by feeling the texture of the red, white, and blue beads. If as a child, she learned to differentiate and arrange the beads as material artifacts, Sakina now understands how the beads are integral to heightened diverse vernacular expression in patterns and colors. She is particularly absorbed by the emankiki, a circular beaded neck to chest body decorate that rests on the shoulders of married Maasai women. And Ole Likekini, in the time that they spend together in the afternoon when the rest of the family is having a nap, he becomes her mentor and he guides her to rediscover her aesthetic inner self, thus creating an intense private moment of Isikar, which I'm not sure whether I pronounced it right, which in Maasai is the equivalent of joy, freedom, or splendor. And this is a deep aesthetic spiritual experience akin to the experience of Ras, which has defined her being and growing towards adulthood. The experiences of cross-cultural ecstasy create emotional surges in the artist protagonist. I feel I am the Emankiki in the geography of patterns. I feel I am the zebra galloping in the sky. I feel I am the song of the Emankiki. And therefore, as a traditional embroidery artist herself, Sakina is emotionally and spiritually affected by the process of learning how to make the Masai Emankiki while drawing on her knowledge of Koja embroidery. Her keen eye for patterned art becomes a means of synthesizing her multiple heritages from both sides of the Indian Ocean and a private means of experiencing her inner artistic self suppressed by an overbearing patriarchal family setup. Okay? And she describes this experience of making the Mankiki. It embraces me as if it were a child with arms around me, touching my breast to show its warmth. I feel its colors, waves in rhythm, the body breath tempo, rise and fall of the chest. As if it were a lover's warm breath, his firm body on me. The Emankiki is rich in exhibition. It mesmerizes me looking at it, stealing the luster of the heart's flame. I am bewildered by its smell of the crowd, redolent with burned all oriole wood. Smell of smoked milk and earth, mixed odors of sweaty cow udders and rich grassy manure. I run my fingers over the beads in circles and press the Emankiki to my ears to hear the language of the colors of the land. You can see how it's a very rich, sensual, artistic, aesthetic, cultural experience. Sakina gives birth to her firstborn and suffers from postpartum depression, and she constantly keeps turning back to Ole Lekentini for spiritual guidance and healing. And this relationship, this very unique relationship, leads to a synthesis of thoughts that are both Asian and African. And therefore, contrary to the general image of Asian woman as being only commercial minded, she develops a close bonding with the land which impacts her deeply at the time of her dislocation from Kenya to Canada 3 decades later. Somjee, however, presents Sakina as a sole Asian participant in the creation of an aesthetic interplay that is Asian African. And this draws our attention to tensions within the community on blocking personal adornments of the other on female bodies. Sakina's mother-in-law is very vocal in expressing her dislike of Sakina's fascination with the Masai adornment. And she tells Sakina, well, it's all right, I suppose, to make one, maybe, but don't wear it. In our family, we do not wear fake beads, only real ones and gold, unquote. Somjee does not shy away from the two-facedness of the community on questions of race and integration and takes up the contentious theme of racial prejudice in his next novel, which is Home Between Crossing, where he uses the trope of the kanga cloth as a possible bridge to deal with the complex dynamics of African-Asian relationships. And so I come to his second text, Home Between Crossing. This continues with the life of Sakina. She is now known as Moti Bai, indicating a total identification with the beads as part of her life. And if the technique of Koja embroidery and Masai beadwork played a significant role in bead buys, Somjee engages with Kanga, the cloth, as a trope to explore the meeting of the cultures of land and oceanic immigrations at the at the Indian Ocean coast. The Kanga is a printed cloth worn by East African women. It is often almost sold in a pair and carries a printed proverbial inscription. If you look closely at these pictures, you can see each of the cloth has a proverbial inscription. For almost a century, Kangas were designed and printed in India, apart from the Far East and Europe. And many of the symbols used in the Kanga have roots in European, African, or Indian Ocean cultures. For example, the paisley print is as popular in India as it is on the Kanga, and it shows the transference of aesthetics across ocean trade routes. Once again, what does Somjee do? He takes a material artifact and uses a material artifact to become a storyteller, uses a Kanga to become a storyteller, born of the cultures of the ocean and the land, unquote. The intention of this proverb cloth is for the wearer to communicate its message, and Rebecca Green explains how the Kanga functions as a complex mode of communication. She explains that women would wear the cloth, and I quote, so that the intended recipient of the message may see it when she walks past their house or business, or by visiting a neighbor, or by wearing it at home. Somjee evocatively describes Kanga as a cloth that speaks wisdom, in that it carries stories of the Indian Ocean in women's voices. It represents a legacy of oral traditions that would be passed along the women of the East African coast, across cultures, across the Koja culture, across the Swahili culture, and therefore it becomes a fabric, and I cite Somjee, whose threads knit the genealogies of women of the Indian Ocean. The Kanga, as one of the characters in the text tells us, the Kanga was bequeathed to us, the Swahili women of the coast of Africa, by our ancestral slave mothers in the households of wealthy Arab royals, merchants, and sailors of the Indian Ocean. The cloth carries love in it and the sorrows of their hearts. It speaks wisdom in the elders' minds and shows colors and patterns of sea, water, and migrations. Together they speak lyrics of cloth art of the Indian Ocean. I hear it in my body when I wear the Kanga, when I'm sad, and seek joy, and also when I'm happy and want to show my happiness. Dan Owang points out that the domestic realm is one of the most fraught themes in narratives of contact zones between Indians and Black East Africans. Somjee's narratives, on the other hand, focus on the complexities of interaction between relationships between Asian and African women. Despite her experience of cross-racial friendship in Bir Bai, Moti Bai, in the second narrative, continues to assert her position as an Indian mistress in an exchange with Frida, the 16-year-old Kamba girl from the Catholic mission. Her tone is reflective of the voice of authority of the house, voice of the master, the voice of a superior race, the voice of the privileged, the voice of an Asian, unquote. The fact that Motibai is troubled by the institutionalized racial divide, which is unable to cross, suggests the first step of a conscious awakening of her position as a privileged Asian woman. In the preface to the novel, the fact that he uses the Kanga as a repository of Swahili oral histories of the past of women from matrilineal descent, and the Kangas therefore function like stories on shelves in the library. In the section titled Kanga of the Indian Ocean, we have the voice of Risiki, who is a coastal Swahili woman who was the second wife of Sakina's brother Shamsu. She has not been accepted by the Koja community on the basis of her racial identity, and she, however, wishes for the Koja to accept her son Isa, who is derogatorily dismissed as a half-caste or a chotara, and is pained that her husband's family has kept Isa at a distance, and I quote, as if his dark skin and curled hair have a disease that will contaminate them, unquote. In the course of time, 3 Asian Koja women visit Risiki's home to discuss Isa's future. And this is when Risiki's grandmother takes out 3 pairs of Kanga from her kasha, or the family chest of 100 Kangas. So Nana plays a similar role to Ole Likakini in terms of her age and wisdom, drawing from African art. If Ole Likikini mentored Sakina on the Maasai worldview, Nana draws from the wisdom of proverbs and legends of her Swahili past. And she gives each of the Koga women a kanga from her kasha as an appeal to the sense of fairness of the Koja women to acknowledge Risiki as a co-wife to Shamsu's Koja wife. Risiki is upset at this gesture, giving away what she considers as her legacy. But for Nana, the cloth is seen to act as a bridge. And in the gesture of giving the kanga to Indian woman, she asserts, new relations are made, broken ones mended. She explains a Swahili saying, to make a tie on the kanga, you need two ends. And this is the passage from the text where she is explaining the relationship and the heritage that the Kanga symbolizes. Motibai accepts Risiki's invitation to participate in an evening of an all-women's gathering to say farewell to a bride, and she's drawn to taking part in a dance called the Chakacha, which, like the Kanga and the language Swahili, has evolved as a synthesis of culture and oceanic migrations. Her body moves to the rhythm of the tarab, and she reflects a humming evokes the woman in me native to Africa. Risiki's red kanga, I like to, but I'm not able to, beckons her to join the dance with her. And yet the deep ambiguity of her own identity stops her from doing so as she ponders, how do I receive Risiki's Swahili over the Gujarati native in me? I mean her everything Swahili over everything Gujarati in me. The gift that is given by Nana to Motibai has a rich repository of meaning. Every bird flies on its own wings. And the first steps towards change is Motibai's acceptance of the Kanga as being central to her self-realization, as is her Bandini, that is the silk and dye shawl with a heavy silver embroidered body associated with Sampat marriages. The Bandhani is considered as an essential requisite of Koja woman at the time of marriage and is linked to her identity as a wife or married woman. If for Motibai, the family Bandhani becomes a symbolic anchor to her Indian Koja heritage, then the Kanga as a cloth that tells stories becomes integral to her desire to become the storyteller of the gendered stories of her motherland, Africa. The novel ends with Motibai being compelled to immigrate out of East Africa from the 1960s onwards, when there comes an escalation of anti-Asian sentiment. Her children first relocate to Canada, and she is compelled to leave the only home she has known her entire life. And at 52, she packs 3 sisters. And these 3 sisters are what represent her identity as an Asian African woman. Her Bandhani, the Emankiki, and the 2 Kangas given to her by Nana. On the eve of her departure from Africa, she visits the cemetery of the Kojas in Nairobi, where 2 generations of her ancestors have been buried. A deeply distraught Motibai asks herself at the graves of her ancestors as to what would happen to the legacy of the community in East Africa after they have been compelled to migrate outwards. Their stories lies with them, for who knows and who cares who the Asian Africans were. What stories did they tell? Where did they live? What did they build? Why did they leave? I'd like to conclude by summarizing that what makes the work of Sultan Somjee unique is his focus on artifacts of art, both oral and visual, as a means of addressing the complexities of Asian-African race relations. His sensual description of the artifacts in terms of colors, texts, and forms captures an aesthetic pulse that transcends race and creed. And Sakina's experiences have shown that cross-cultural negotiations and reconciliations are indeed possible. As Motibai sets forth for a painful transition from Kenya to Canada, She carries the Utu values that she has imbibed through Africa's art, recognizing the importance of passing these values on through the stories that she will now relate. She makes a silent pledge to the African earth which has birthed her that Africa's stories would travel with her and survive as a legacy to be preserved and shared with the coming generations. And I end with this quotation at the end of the text. I will always carry her story in the proverbs of the Kanga and her beauty in the beads of the Amankiki, embracing her mountains, the rivers, and the savannah mirrored in the sky. In my heart, I will carry the zebra's gallop and the shadows of the clouds on the savannah is beauty, not God's ornament. Thank you.